I am Elena, and I am 32 years old. For 14 incredibly long and exhausting years, I built a massive, global business empire entirely from scratch, while my own family treated me like a useless, embarrassing burden. On a freezing, stormy Thursday night, my father looked me dead in the eye, pointed a trembling finger at the front door of my childhood home, and said the words that would alter the course of our lives forever. "Go live in the streets if you have to," he yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Maybe that will wake you up." He threw me out while my mother stood by with her arms crossed in silent approval, and my golden child older brother laughed out loud at what they all referred to as my little internet thing. But there is one massive, earth-shattering detail they did not know. I was not some broke, naive failure coasting through life on empty dreams. I was making $15 million a year. And the very people who threw me away like yesterday's trash to protect their perfect, high-status suburban image are now the ones begging me for a dime of the real estate I legally bought right out from under them. Before I tell you exactly how I systematically dismantled their entire fake world and took back my dignity, hit that like button if you believe in absolute justice. And please, do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything to me. Now, let us go back to the exact moment the nightmare began. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday evening that felt like something ripped straight out of a bleak movie. The rain was pouring down in absolute sheets, slamming against the windshield of my car as I navigated the winding, perfectly manicured roads of my parents' upscale neighborhood. The oak trees lining the street were whipping back and forth in the wind. My mother had texted me earlier that afternoon, asking if I could come over to help with some heavy lifting in the garage. It was a strange request, considering they usually hired people for manual labor, but I was the dutiful daughter. I always showed up. I always tried to prove my worth to them. I should have known it was a meticulously planned trap. When I finally pulled into their sweeping driveway, I parked my car, a deliberately unremarkable, 5-year-old dark sedan that I kept specifically for family visits so I would not draw any unwanted attention or snide remarks about my spending habits. I walked up the brick pathway, shaking the freezing rain off my umbrella, and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The house smelled exactly as it always did, a suffocating mix of lemon polish, expensive vanilla candles, and unspoken judgment. There was no furniture to move. The garage door was shut tight. Instead, I walked into the main living room and found a tribunal waiting for me. My father was pacing the gleaming hardwood floor, his hands clasped behind his back like a general preparing to dress down a subordinate. My older brother, Julian, was sprawled out on the expensive white leather couch. He was wearing a designer suit, his tie perfectly loosened, swirling a glass of deep red wine. He was smirking, his eyes gleaming with the kind of malicious anticipation you only see in bullies who know they have the upper hand. My mother stood rigidly by the grand stone fireplace. Her arms were tightly crossed over her cashmere sweater, and she looked at me like I was a stranger who had just tracked thick, foul mud onto her pristine Persian rugs. I stood there in the entryway, water dripping from the hem of my coat, pooling on the floor. I asked them what was going on. My father stopped pacing, turned on his heel, and glared at me. He did not ask about my day. He did not offer me a towel. He launched right into his prepared speech. He told me that I was 32 years old, and it was painfully clear to everyone that my online nonsense was not going anywhere. He said I had wasted the best years of my life chasing a pipe dream, and that I was squandering whatever pathetic potential I had left. I felt my jaw tighten. The muscles in my neck seized up. I asked him what exactly he was getting at, keeping my voice as low and steady as possible. That was when he raised his hand and pointed directly toward the heavy front door I had just walked through. He stated, with absolute venom in his voice, that I had been living in my cheap little apartment for years, constantly coming over and asking for help with small things. He said they could not keep enabling me anymore. Enabling me. The word hung in the cold air like toxic black smoke. My mind raced. I had not asked them for a single dollar since I was 18 years old. Not for rent, not for groceries, not even to cover a parking ticket. The small things he was referring to were the chores they demanded I do for them. I came over to fix their Wi-Fi, to organize their garage, to run errands they deemed beneath Julian. But in their deeply distorted reality, because I did not wear a corporate badge or boast a prestigious job title, I was a charity case, sucking the life out of them. Julian let out a sharp, condescending laugh that cut right through the tension. He took a sip of his wine, leaned forward, and looked at me with pure pity. He told me that I had been coasting for over a decade. He asked if I honestly thought anyone in their social circle actually believed I was making a living off my little online business. He called my life sad. My mother stepped in then, her voice sharp, cold, and utterly uncompromising. She declared that she and my father had made a final decision. It was time for me to stand on my own 2 feet for real. There would be no more coming to their house. There would be no more expecting them to act as my safety net. They were cutting the cord. I stared at the 3 of them. I felt a bizarre mix of shock and profound clarity. I told them, very calmly, that I did not need a bailout. I told them I was doing just fine on my own. But my father was not interested in the truth. He wanted a performance. He raised his voice, his face turning a blotchy red with righteous indignation. He stepped closer to me, invading my personal space, and yelled that if I was doing so fine, I could prove it by surviving without their charity. He told me to leave immediately. And then he delivered the line that will stay burned in my memory for the rest of my life. Go live in the streets if you have to. Maybe that will wake you up. The room went dead quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. The rain lashed furiously against the large picture windows. I glanced over at Julian. He was watching the scene unfold like it was a premium television drama, highly entertained by my supposed downfall. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to fall to my knees, cry, apologize for being a failure, and beg Julian to use his connections to get me a low-level administrative job answering phones at his law firm. They wanted total submission. They had absolutely no idea that I could buy their entire estate, demolish it, and rebuild it 3 times over without even making a dent in my primary investment accounts. I did not scream. I did not cry. The tears they were waiting for never came. Instead, I reached down, picked up my damp jacket from where I had dropped it on a chair, and slipped it back on. I looked my father right in his angry eyes, and then I looked at my mother, whose face was completely devoid of maternal warmth. I smiled. It was a soft, genuine smile of total liberation. I told them that if this was what they truly wanted, I would respect their wishes perfectly. I turned my back on them, walked out into the freezing rain, and pulled the heavy door shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud. I walked down the driveway, the cold water soaking my hair, and got into my unassuming car. As I started the engine, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I expected to see a broken woman. But I did not. I saw someone who was finally free. I drove for 30 minutes, leaving the suffocating confines of their suburban neighborhood far behind me. I drove into the heart of the city and pulled into the highly secure, private underground garage of my actual home. My home was not the cramped, run-down apartment they loved to imagine I lived in. It was a massive, ultra-modern penthouse occupying the top floor of a premier high-rise. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. I walked inside, dropped my keys on the marble counter, and walked into my study, which was lined with rare, leather-bound books and original artwork. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked over to the massive window, and looked down at the tiny cars moving like ants below. For years, I had kept my wealth a carefully guarded secret. I had done it out of a misguided sense of love. I knew that if my parents found out I was a multimillionaire, it would completely shatter their worldview. It would eclipse Julian's achievements, and they would resent me for it. I thought playing the role of the quiet, struggling daughter was a way to keep the peace. But looking out over the city that night, I realized the horrifying truth. They did not want peace. They wanted a punching bag. And they had just thrown their favorite punching bag out into the storm. I thought the worst was over. I thought walking away was the final chapter of our toxic history. I was so incredibly wrong. To truly understand how a family could effortlessly throw their own daughter out into a storm without a second thought, you have to understand the deeply toxic, twisted dynamic I grew up in. In our household, love was never a given. Love was not unconditional. Love was a highly volatile currency, and you had to earn it every single day through status, appearances, and the approval of the neighbors. My parents measured a person's absolute worth by their job title, the brand of their car, and their zip code. And by those shallow metrics, my older brother Julian was an absolute god walking among mortals. Julian was the golden child from the moment he drew his first breath. He was older, louder, and fiercely ambitious in all the conventional ways my parents worshipped. Throughout my childhood, the disparity was glaring. When Julian wanted to play lacrosse, my parents bought him the most expensive custom gear without blinking. When I asked to join a local art class, I was told money was tight and I needed to focus on practical things. The ultimate betrayal happened when it was time for college. Julian went to a top-tier university. His tuition, his luxury off-campus apartment, and his spending money were completely funded by the college fund my parents had meticulously saved for years. They bragged about his university to anyone who would listen. But when it was my turn to go to college 3 years later, the narrative suddenly changed. My father sat me down and solemnly explained that the economy was tough, his 401k had taken a hit, and I would need to take out massive student loans if I wanted to study. There was no college fund left for me. They had drained it all to ensure Julian lived like a prince. So, at 18, I made a choice that branded me the black sheep of the family forever. I walked away from the traditional college route. I refused to start my life drowning in a mountain of debt while my brother was handed everything on a silver platter. I decided to start my own e-commerce venture from my tiny bedroom. I remember the day I told them. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee with a silver spoon, looking at me like I had just announced I was joining a cult. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. She said I would never amount to anything without a degree. My father did not even look up from his newspaper. He just grunted in agreement. They wrote me off right then and there. I was no longer an investment. I was a liability. Every family gathering from that point forward became a carefully orchestrated stage for my public humiliation. Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister, was the absolute worst instigator. She was the kind of woman who disguised her venom as sweet, motherly concern. Every Thanksgiving, without fail, she would pass the mashed potatoes across the dining table, look at me with fake pity, and ask loudly when I was going to give up my little internet hobby and find a husband with a real salary to support me. She loved to bring up her own small inheritance from my grandfather, hinting that people who worked on computers all day lacked real work ethic. Julian would always chime in, adjusting his Rolex, suggesting I could work the reception desk at his corporate law firm if I learned how to dress properly. I endured it. Every single holiday, I smiled tightly. I bit the inside of my cheek until it bled. I kept my mouth completely shut. Because while they were busy mocking me and drinking expensive wine, I was busy building an empire. In my early 20s, I worked 18-hour days. I sacrificed my social life, my sleep, and my youth. I ate cheap ramen noodles while building a niche e-commerce supply chain that eventually grew into a massive network of highly profitable, global companies. By the time I was 27, I had purchased my first investment property in cash. I had an entire staff. I was negotiating international shipping contracts. But I kept it all a total secret from my family. I wanted peace more than I wanted validation. Their toxic influence did not just stay within the four walls of our family home. It poisoned my personal life too. When I was 25, before my business had fully exploded into the millions, I dated a man named David. I genuinely loved him. I thought we were going to build a life together. But David came from a broken home. His parents had gone through a vicious, messy divorce over financial issues, so he was deeply terrified of financial instability. My family smelled blood in the water. One evening, Julian invited David out for drinks under the guise of getting to know his future brother-in-law. Over bourbon, Julian systematically dismantled me. He told David that I was a financial liability, a stubborn dreamer who refused to get a real job, and that I would eventually drag David down into crippling debt. He planted the seed of doubt so deep that David could not ignore it. 2 weeks later, David broke up with me. We stood in a cold parking lot, and he told me he needed a partner with a real career, someone who wouldn't be a burden. My own brother had sabotaged the one good thing I had, simply because he enjoyed exerting control. That breakup shattered me, but out of that profound heartbreak came the ultimate turning point of my life. My former boss from a part-time job I held at 19, an older gentleman named Mr. Henderson, saw the devastation in my eyes. Mr. Henderson was a retired executive who had always believed in my relentless work ethic. When banks refused to look at the business plan of a 25-year-old college dropout, Mr. Henderson became my first angel investor. He sat across from me in a diner, handed me a check for $50,000, and told me I had a fire in me that could burn down forests if I directed it the right way. I paid him back tenfold within 2 years, but his unwavering belief in me was the armor I wore against my family's constant, grinding emotional abuse. Now, cut back to the present. It had been exactly 2 weeks since that rainy Thursday night when my father threw me out. I was working from my penthouse office, surrounded by the absolute silence of my success. I did not expect a grand apology. I knew them too well for that. But some small, foolish, naive part of my inner child thought my mother might at least send a text message to check if I was sleeping in a homeless shelter. Instead, the silence was broken by a text message from my younger cousin, Chloe. Chloe was the daughter of my dad's younger brother, and she was the only person in our extended family who treated me like a human being. She was observant, quiet, and absolutely loyal to me. Her text lit up my phone screen, and the words made my blood run completely cold. She asked if I was okay. I replied, asking her to define what okay meant in our family. Chloe typed back a long paragraph. She told me that she had attended a family dinner the night before. My mother had been telling her church friends and our entire extended family that my little internet project had completely collapsed. My mother actually told people with a straight face that I was broke, destitute, and living out of the back seat of my sedan. She said, "Elena will probably come crawling back to us soon when she gets hungry enough." And Julian? Julian had spent the entire evening making jokes. He told the family that he was considering offering me an internship at his law firm so I could learn the value of hard work. He said, "Elena would look good fetching coffee for the real professionals." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The air left my lungs. They were not just dismissing me anymore. They were actively constructing a malicious, fictional narrative of my total destruction. They were reveling in the idea of my suffering. They were using my imaginary homelessness to gain sympathy points from their social circle and elevate their own righteous status. I sat at my massive kitchen island, looking out at the sprawling city lights reflecting off the glass. The final, fraying thread of familial loyalty snapped right then and there in the quiet of my penthouse. I realized that keeping my wealth a secret was no longer protecting the peace. It was giving them the ammunition to destroy my character. They wanted me to be a failure so badly that they were willing to invent the failure themselves. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the notification that popped up on my phone the very next morning. A notification that proved just how depraved, greedy, and utterly heartless my own mother had truly become. It started on a Tuesday morning with a simple, automated email from my bank. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a quarterly earnings report for one of my European subsidiaries, when the notification slid across the top right corner of my monitor. The subject line read in bold, urgent red letters, "Unusual account activity. Immediate attention required." My first instinct was to dismiss it as a sophisticated phishing scam. I am obsessively meticulous with my finances. Every corporate account, real estate trust, and personal portfolio is heavily guarded by top-tier financial advisors and biometric security protocols. But then I looked closer at the specific account number listed in the body of the email. It was not one of my primary accounts. It was a relic from my past. It was an old, mostly dormant savings account that my parents had opened for me when I was a teenager. It was a joint account, originally designed to hold my birthday money, babysitting cash, and odd job savings. I had meant to close it years ago, but it had slipped my mind. Over the past decade, a few minor automated deposits from old affiliate links had trickled into it, quietly accumulating cash without me paying attention. I logged into the secure banking portal, my heart beating a steady, anxious rhythm against my ribs. I pulled up the transaction history for that specific account and my entire body froze. Two massive, sweeping withdrawals had been made within the last 48 hours. The total amount drained was exactly $14,500. The available balance flashing on the screen was literally zero. Both transactions were marked as in-person cashier's checks issued from a local branch. Not just any branch. It was the branch located exactly 2 blocks from my parents' suburban house. Panic is a very strange thing. It bypasses your logic and makes you frantically search for innocent explanations where absolutely none exist. I thought about identity theft. I thought about a catastrophic banking error. I thought about calling a lawyer immediately to file a fraud claim. But a dark, heavy intuition settled in the pit of my stomach. I grabbed my car keys, bypassed my security detail, and drove straight to that specific bank branch. I walked into the quiet lobby, the smell of carpet cleaner and stale coffee hitting my nose, and walked straight up to the teller window. I presented my driver's license and asked the young woman behind the glass to pull up the account history. The teller, a woman named Sarah whose name tag was slightly crooked, tapped away at her keyboard. I asked her point-blank who had authorized the withdrawal of those funds. Sarah looked at the screen, her brow furrowing slightly, and then she looked at me with a perfectly polite, customer service smile. She explained that there was no fraud. She told me that the cosigner on the account had come in person to request the cashier's checks. She remembered the interaction clearly, because it was a significant amount of money. Sarah looked me in the eye and said, "Your mother came in. She was very distressed. She claimed that you had authorized her to access the emergency funds to help your sibling through a sudden financial crisis." She signed the paperwork and walked out with the checks. My own mother. The woman who gave birth to me. The woman who, just a few weeks prior, had stood perfectly still by the stone fireplace and watched her husband throw me out onto the street into a freezing storm. The woman who is currently spending her afternoons telling her church congregation that her daughter was a destitute failure living in a used car. That same woman had walked into a bank, smiled warmly at the teller, lied through her teeth, and stolen $14,500 of my money. I thanked Sarah, my voice completely devoid of emotion, walked out of the bank lobby, and sat down in the driver's seat of my car. I did not turn the engine on. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I could not breathe. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the betrayal felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. It was not about the money. $14,000 was practically a rounding error in my daily operational business budget. I made that much money while I was sleeping. It was the principle. It was the staggering hypocrisy. She took money from a daughter she firmly believed was starving and homeless. I pulled out my phone and immediately called Chloe. I needed eyes and ears on the inside of the family immediately. Chloe picked up on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I quickly explained the stolen money and the bank's confirmation. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Chloe's breathing hitch. Then she spoke, her voice barely above an anxious whisper, terrified someone in her house might hear her. She told me she knew exactly where the money went. Julian had just signed the paperwork for a brand new, fully loaded, midnight black Porsche Cayenne. Chloe explained that Julian had driven the luxury SUV to a family barbecue over the weekend. He had been parading it around, bragging to the uncles and aunts about how it was a well-deserved gift from his loving parents to celebrate his hard work and upcoming promotion at the law firm. Chloe had overheard my mother talking to Aunt Susan. The down payment on the Porsche was exactly $14,500, $500. The puzzle pieces fell into place with sickening, crystal-clear clarity. My mother had walked into a bank, emptied my childhood savings account, taking what she genuinely thought was my absolute last remaining financial lifeline, and handed it straight over to the golden child so he could upgrade his luxury status and show off to his colleagues. She literally stole from her supposedly starving daughter to buy her wealthy, arrogant son a sports car. I ended the call with Chloe and drove back to my penthouse in a state of absolute, icy calm. I did not scream at the windshield. I did not break anything when I got home. The grief, the longing for a normal family, the desperate childhood need for their approval, it was all gone. It was burned away entirely by a cold, calculating, mechanical fury. Later that evening, as I was pouring myself a glass of water, my phone vibrated on the marble kitchen counter. It was a text message from my mother. It was not an apology. It was not a confession of guilt. It was a justification so profoundly twisted and narcissistic that it defied all human logic. The text read, "Hope you're not upset about the savings account. It was just sitting there doing nothing, and your brother needed some help with his new car. You'll make more money someday if you work hard. Family comes first. Family comes first." I read those 3 words over and over again, the glowing letters burning into my retinas. She did not even attempt to hide the theft. She was smug. She was patronizing. She genuinely, deeply believed that because she gave birth to me, she owned me. She believed that whatever pathetic scraps I managed to scrape together in my life belonged to Julian by divine right. She viewed me not as a human being, but as a resource to be harvested for her favorite child. I did not reply to the text. I did not call her and scream. I did not block her number. I set my phone face down on the counter. They wanted to play games with money. They wanted to use finances as a brutal weapon to assert dominance, to humiliate me, and to elevate themselves. They thought I was a helpless, fragile little girl who would just swallow the disrespect, cry herself to sleep, and eventually come crawling back to their Sunday dinners begging for a plate of food. They had absolutely no idea who they had just declared war on. I was about to show them that I did not just hold the high ground. I owned the entire battlefield, and I was about to scorch the earth they stood on. The very next morning, the air in my penthouse felt fundamentally different. The storm of emotion had passed, leaving behind a sharp, clinical focus. I did not go to the police. Having my mother arrested for stealing $14,000 from a joint account would be legally messy, and worse, it would cause a brief, dramatic scandal that she would ultimately spin to make herself the victim. She would cry in court, claim misunderstanding, and Julian would use his legal degree to drag the lawsuit out for years. I did not want a petty, emotional revenge. I wanted complete, systemic, undeniable annihilation of their false reality. I wanted them to experience exactly what they had wished upon me. My first call was to my lead corporate attorney. I instructed him to immediately lock down every single asset, trust fund, business account, and piece of real estate in my name. I severed any remaining financial ties, no matter how microscopic, that could potentially link me to my parents. I changed my Social Security protocols, locked my credit, and built an impenetrable legal fortress around my empire. Then, I reached out to a private financial investigator I frequently used for high-stakes corporate acquisitions. He was an ex-federal agent who specialized in finding the money people tried desperately to hide. I invited him to my penthouse, handed him a file with 3 names, Richard, Margaret, and Julian, and gave him a blank check. I told him I wanted a forensic deep dive into their entire financial existence. I wanted to see their mortgages, their credit scores, their outstanding loans, their investment portfolios, and their hidden debts. Everything. 3 weeks later, the investigator sat across from me in my private study. He placed a thick, black, heavily tabbed folder on my glass desk. What I read inside those pages almost made me laugh out loud. It was a revelation of staggering hypocrisy. Their perfect, wealthy, upper-middle-class image, the image they used to justify treating me like garbage, was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on terrifying, suffocating debt. Let us start with Julian, the hotshot corporate lawyer who needed my stolen money for a down payment. According to the documents, Julian was functionally bankrupt. Despite his massive salary, his lifestyle inflation had ruined him. He had maxed out 6 high-limit credit cards to pay for designer suits and lavish vacations. He had taken out a second mortgage on his luxury condo just to cover his daily expenses. He was currently drowning in high-interest personal loans. That brand-new Porsche Cayenne my mother had stolen my money to fund? He was already late on the first massive monthly payment. He bought the car solely to keep up appearances because he was terrified the senior partners at his law firm would realize he was financially illiterate and deny him his much-anticipated promotion. But the real goldmine, the absolute masterstroke of poetic justice, was found in my father's file. My father, the arrogant man who proudly pointed at the door and told me to go live in the streets, had recently made a massive, ego-driven financial blunder of catastrophic proportions. A year ago, he had personally guaranteed a multi-million-dollar loan for a local commercial property development company. The developer was supposed to build a sprawling block of high-end, luxury townhomes. It was meant to be my father's crowning investment achievement, his ticket to generational wealth. But the developer had grossly mismanaged the funds, the construction had stalled out completely, and the company was circling the drain, bleeding cash every single day. If the development company officially defaulted on the bank loan, the personal guarantee meant my father was legally on the hook for the full, staggering amount. It would completely wipe out his retirement savings, liquidate his stock portfolio, and force the bank to seize and sell their precious suburban house just to cover the deficit. And according to the investigators' inside contacts, the bank had lost patience. They were preparing to foreclose on the project and trigger the personal guarantee in exactly 1 month. At that exact same time, the investigator revealed a complication. A wealthy, aggressive rival investor named Marcus was sniffing around the distressed property. Marcus was known for buying bad bank debt for pennies on the dollar and liquidating assets ruthlessly. If Marcus bought the debt, my father would be ruined, but I would have no part in the execution. I could not let that happen. The universe had handed me the perfect weapon, and I was not about to let Marcus pull the trigger. The moment the investigator left, I picked up the phone and called Arthur. Arthur was the CEO of a massive, ruthless real estate investment firm that I regularly partnered with. Arthur respected me implicitly because my capital had made his firm millions in past ventures. I told Arthur I wanted to acquire a specific distressed asset, and I wanted it done quietly, rapidly, and through a blind shell company. I wired the massive amount of capital immediately, bypassing Marcus entirely through Arthur's back-channel connections with the bank. Within 48 hours, I had secured absolute, controlling ownership of the entire townhome development project. On paper, the transaction looked like nothing more than a smart, aggressive corporate acquisition by an unnamed corporate entity. In reality, I now held the physical deed to my father's financial survival. I owned the land. I owned the debt. I held his entire future in the palm of my hand. While I was quietly tightening the legal noose around their finances, I was also preparing my public debut. I could not just destroy them in the shadows. They needed to see exactly who was holding the axe. Months earlier, I had met Victoria Vance, the formidable, highly respected editor-in-chief of a premier national business magazine. She had been asking to feature my journey for a long time, but I had always declined to protect my family's ego. I pulled her business card from my drawer and called her directly. I told her I was finally ready for the cover story. Victoria moved with lightning speed. She sent her top photography and styling team to my corporate headquarters. I bypassed the modest clothes I usually wore around my family. I wore a sharp, impeccably tailored designer suit that cost more than my mother's wedding ring. I posed with the sprawling city skyline behind me, looking directly into the camera with unapologetic power. I even brought my custom Ferrari out of the private garage for the lifestyle shots, leaning against the hood with a calm, victorious smile. Then, I sat down for a raw, 3-hour interview with Victoria. I laid bare my entire journey. I talked about starting from absolute nothing. I talked about the overwhelming rejection, the sleepless nights, and the crushing weight of being told by the people closest to me that I would fail. I talked about building a $15 million a year empire while the world doubted my very existence. I did not name my parents or Julian directly. I did not have to. The context was devastatingly clear. The headline Victoria chose for the cover was absolutely perfect, from doubt to dominance, the underestimated entrepreneur who bought the world. I coordinated the timeline with surgical precision. The magazine was scheduled to hit newsstands nationwide and blast across every major digital platform on the exact same Monday that the bank officially finalized my shell company's acquisition of my father's failed real estate project. The storm was fully brewed. The trap was perfectly, inescapably set. I sat in my penthouse, looking at the glossy advanced copy of the magazine cover on my desk, and waited for Monday morning to arrive. My family thought they had buried me deep in the dirt. They did not realize I was a seed, and I was about to tear through their concrete foundation. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crisp, brilliant sunlight that makes the entire city look like it is constructed of polished glass and endless possibilities. I woke up at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, long before the rest of the world had even started their coffee makers. I went through my usual rigorous gym routine in my private penthouse fitness center, took a cold shower, and sat down at my massive marble kitchen island. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop. I did not have to wait long for the tectonic plates of my life to shift. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, the digital edition of the premier business magazine went live across every major platform. By 8 o'clock, the glossy physical copies were prominently displayed on newsstands from New York to Los Angeles. I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen and watched the advanced analytics dashboard on my computer screen light up like a Christmas tree. The traffic to my corporate websites began to spike so dramatically that my IT department sent an automated alert. The internet was rapidly waking up to the story of the severely underestimated female entrepreneur who had built a $15 million empire in total, absolute silence. Then, the dam broke. My personal phone, which I kept tightly restricted to a very small circle of contacts, began to ring and vibrate endlessly. First, it was the emails from old college acquaintances who had completely ignored my existence for the better part of a decade. Then came the frantic LinkedIn connection requests from senior corporate executives who would not have given me the time of day a week prior. But I was not waiting for their validation. I was waiting for the inevitable, deeply predictable reaction from the wealthy suburbs. I was waiting for the people who had recently pointed at the front door and told me to go live in the streets. At 9:15, my phone vibrated with a new text message. The caller ID simply read, "Mother." I opened the message and read the words, my face completely devoid of any recognizable expression. The text read, "Elena, my darling girl. Your father and I just saw the magazine cover at the grocery store. We are in absolute shock. We had absolutely no idea your business had gotten this massive and successful. We are so incredibly proud of you. You have always been our brilliant, hardworking girl. Please call us when you have a second. Family is everything." I read the message 3 times, letting the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy wash over me. This was the exact same woman who had brazenly walked into a local bank branch, lied directly to a teller's face, and stolen over $14,000 from my childhood savings account simply because she thought I was a destitute failure who would never be able to fight back. This was the woman who had spent the last entire month telling her church congregation, her country club friends, and anyone who would listen that I was a massive disappointment currently living out of my used car. And now, suddenly, magically, I was her brilliant girl. Now, suddenly, family was everything. It was nauseating. 10 minutes later, I received a voicemail notification. It was from Julian. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker, letting the sound of his voice fill my empty kitchen. Julian's tone was dripping with that fake, highly polished corporate charm he usually reserved for his wealthiest law firm clients. He said, "Hey sis, Julian here. Just read the feature article." Absolutely phenomenal stuff, really top-tier work. I always knew you had that killer instinct in you, right from the start. Listen, we should really grab a drink or dinner this week. I am looking at some very lucrative real estate investment opportunities, and I think we could partner up. Give me a call back, let's talk numbers. He always knew I had that killer instinct. That was a truly fascinating perspective coming from the exact man who had actively, maliciously sabotaged my past relationship, who constantly mocked my career at every single Thanksgiving dinner, and who had literally used my stolen money to pay the down payment on his luxury sports car. They did not love me. They did not suddenly respect my journey. They loved the power, the immense status, and the undeniable wealth they suddenly realized I possessed. They looked at my hard-earned empire and immediately calculated how they could siphon prestige and money from it to fund their own hollow lives. I did not reply to the text message. I did not return the voicemail. Instead, I picked up my secure office line and called my executive assistant, Clara. Clara is a ruthlessly efficient, fiercely intelligent woman who knows exactly how to handle high-stakes corporate and personal situations without asking unnecessary questions. I told Clara to arrange a dinner for 4 people for that coming Friday night. I instructed her to book the private dining room at the absolute most exclusive, ridiculously expensive, high-society restaurant in the downtown financial district. It was the kind of restaurant where you had to be a celebrity, a politician, or know the owner personally just to get a reservation on a Friday night. It was the exact kind of place my parents always dreamed of dining at so they could brag about it at their HOA meetings, but could never actually afford on my father's salary. I told Clara to send the formal invitations directly to my parents and Julian via a high-end courier service, under the explicit guise of celebrating my recent magazine feature and discussing a massive new family financial venture. I knew that specific phrasing would act like fresh blood in the water for a family of desperate, social climbing sharks. They would not be able to resist the bait. They would come running. Friday evening finally arrived. I left my office early and spent an hour preparing myself in my penthouse. I did not dress to impress them. I dressed for absolute, unmitigated war. I wore a custom-tailored, charcoal gray designer suit that projected nothing but authority. I clasped a vintage luxury watch around my wrist that cost significantly more than Julian's yearly salary. My makeup was subtle, flawless, and completely impenetrable. I drove my custom Ferrari into the heart of the city and handed the keys to the visibly impressed valet. I walked into the dimly lit, opulent restaurant, the heavy smell of black truffles, roasted meats, and expensive champagne lingering in the air. When the impeccably dressed maitre d' escorted me down the long, carpeted hallway and opened the heavy mahogany doors to the private dining room, my family was already there waiting. The visual was almost comical in its desperation. My father was wearing his absolute best, slightly outdated navy suit. He stood up immediately as I walked in, rushing forward to shake my hand vigorously like we were old, trusted business associates closing a major deal. My mother was wearing a heavy pearl necklace and a brand new cocktail dress she had clearly purchased just for this specific occasion. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a tight, theatrical hug. It was the first time she had physically hugged me in over a decade. I stood perfectly still. I felt absolutely nothing. No warmth. No love. Just the cold calculation of the trap I was about to spring. Julian was sitting confidently at the head of the heavy oak table, swirling a glass of very expensive scotch. He stood up, gave me a bright, completely artificial smile showing all of his perfectly whitened teeth, and patted me aggressively on the shoulder. He immediately complimented my watch, his eyes scanning the brand and the intricate dial with poorly hidden, ravenous envy. We all sat down. The waiters immediately appeared, pouring glasses of a vintage champagne that cost thousands of dollars a bottle. For the first entire hour, the dinner was a horrifying masterclass in psychological delusion and gaslighting. My parents completely rewrote our entire shared history right in front of my face. My father raised his crystal glass for a toast, looked at me with shining, completely fabricated tears in his eyes, and actually had the nerve to say that his brand of tough love was the sole catalyst for my current success. He looked at me and said that when he kicked me out into the freezing rain that night, he was just trying to push me to achieve my ultimate potential. He claimed he knew I needed a massive fire lit under me, and he was so incredibly proud that his harsh parenting strategy had finally paid off. He was taking credit for my 14 years of blood, sweat, and tears. My mother chimed in right on cue, placing her manicured hand gently over mine. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper and said the situation with the stolen savings account was just a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding. She claimed it was a temporary, necessary loan to help Julian with a minor, unexpected cash flow issue. She smiled sweetly and said she knew I would completely understand because, at this level of success, family wealth is meant to be shared and protected. She squeezed my hand and said they were completely ready to put the silly misunderstandings of the past behind them and move forward as a united, incredibly powerful family dynasty. Julian leaned across the table, aggressively cutting into his thick, dry-aged steak, and smoothly transitioned into his premeditated sales pitch. He mentioned that he was feeling stifled at his current law firm and was actively looking for a silent, wealthy partner to help him open his own elite private legal practice. He casually, almost arrogantly, suggested that a multi-million-dollar investment from my corporate accounts would yield incredible returns for both of us and, most importantly, keep the wealth securely inside the family bloodline. I sat there quietly, meticulously cutting my food into small pieces, taking slow sips of sparkling water. I let them talk. I let them build their beautiful, fragile, utterly pathetic fantasy. I let them completely intoxicate themselves with the delusional idea that I was going to blindly fund their luxurious, debt-ridden lifestyles. I watched them gorge themselves on the most expensive food on the menu, completely blinded by their own relentless greed and inflated self-importance. I waited patiently until the waiters cleared the main courses, wiped the crumbs from the table, and poured the after-dinner espresso. The table was perfectly clean. The atmosphere was incredibly relaxed. They thought they had won. Then I reached down, and the trap snapped shut with devastating force. The private dining room was perfectly quiet, save for the soft, ambient jazz playing from the hidden speakers in the ceiling. My mother was halfway through asking me, with a totally straight face, if I wanted to fund and host the entire extended family for Thanksgiving at a luxury ski resort in Aspen this year. She was completely oblivious to the temperature rapidly dropping in the room. I did not answer her question. I wiped my mouth slowly with a heavy linen napkin, placed it neatly on the table beside my empty espresso cup, and reached down into the leather corporate briefcase resting against the leg of my chair. I pulled out the thick, black, heavily tabbed folder that my financial investigator and Arthur had meticulously compiled for me. I placed it perfectly in the center of the table. The dull thud of the heavy folder hitting the wood echoed in the quiet room. My father looked at the folder, a confident, greedy smile playing on his lips. He probably thought it was a detailed portfolio of high-yield investment opportunities, or perhaps the official trust fund documents I had set up to guarantee their early retirement. He reached out eagerly and pulled the folder toward him. I sat back in my chair, crossed my legs, rested my hands in my lap, and watched his face with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing an experiment. My father opened the heavy black cover. The very first document staring back at him was the official, legally binding deed and the aggressive debt transfer agreement for his massive, currently failing commercial real estate development project. I watched the exact, precise microsecond his reality violently shattered. His confident smile faltered, then completely vanished. His eyes began to dart rapidly across the dense legal jargon, his pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated confusion and rising panic. He looked at the signature line of the acquiring holding company, and then his eyes dragged down to the addendum that clearly, undeniably listed me, his daughter, as the sole majority shareholder, primary investor, and CEO of that specific entity. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of ashen gray. His hands, which had been so steady while holding his champagne glass, began to visibly tremble. The paper shook in his grip. He looked up at me, his breathing suddenly shallow, his voice barely a raspy whisper. He said, "Elena, this is our property. This is the luxury townhome development I guaranteed. How in the world did you get these legal documents?" I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows on the thick oak table, and locked my eyes completely with his. My voice was perfectly calm, incredibly steady, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a failing subordinate. I corrected him immediately. I told him that it used to be his property. I told him that it was mine now. Julian dropped his heavy silver fork. It clattered incredibly loudly against his porcelain dessert plate, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. My mother looked frantically back and forth between my father's terrified face and my completely blank expression, panic beginning to violently fracture her perfectly composed, Botox-smoothed face. She practically shrieked, asking what was going on and demanding someone explain the documents to her. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I delivered the absolute, crushing facts like a seasoned surgeon performing a necessary, bloody amputation. I explained to them that the shady real estate developer my father had foolishly trusted had completely and criminally mismanaged the construction funds. I told them that the bank was quietly, aggressively preparing to foreclose on the entire property within the week and officially trigger my father's multi-million-dollar personal guarantee. I explained, in agonizing detail, that an aggressive, ruthless rival investor was merely days away from buying the bad debt, which would have resulted in the bank liquidating my father's entire life savings, seizing his stock portfolio, and forcing the immediate sale of their precious suburban house. My father's breathing became a rapid, shallow wheeze. He stammered, pulling at his collar, asking how I possibly knew all of this highly confidential financial information. I completely ignored his question and continued my execution. I told them that I had stepped in at the final hour. I had my trusted corporate partners purchase the distressed debt directly from the bank's commercial lending division in a completely cash-heavy transaction. I acquired total, controlling ownership of the entire development project legally, efficiently, and at a massive fraction of its projected future value. My mother's face flushed a deep, furious, ugly red. Her fiercely protective instincts for her husband and her own lifestyle flared up, completely blinding her to the legal reality of the situation. She slammed her manicured hand hard on the table, rattling the crystal glasses, and yelled at me. "Elena, how could you possibly do this to your own father? You went behind his back and maliciously stole his project. You have to call your lawyers and transfer the deed back to us immediately. This is family business. You cannot do this to us." I looked at her, my expression turning to pure, unforgiving ice. I asked her how I could possibly do it. I asked her if she really, truly wanted to sit in this restaurant and talk to me about stealing. I systematically dismantled them. I reminded her of the freezing, rainy Thursday night when they summoned me to their house for the sole purpose of humiliating me. I reminded her of the exact, venomous words my father used when he told me to go live in the streets. Then, I turned my attention directly to Julian. I looked at his perfectly tailored suit and brought up the brand new, fully loaded Porsche Cayenne currently sitting in his driveway. I stated clearly, my voice slicing through the room, that my mother had walked into a bank branch, blatantly lied to a teller named Sarah about a fake family emergency, and drained $14,500 of my childhood savings to pay for Julian's luxury car down payment. I told them I knew Julian was completely drowning in maxed-out credit card debt, that his second mortgage was in arrears, and that he was facing potential, career-ending bankruptcy. Julian's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He looked at my parents, sheer terror in his eyes, realizing his perfect, highly curated financial facade had just been brutally and irreversibly exposed. He opened his mouth to defend himself, trying to quickly deploy his aggressive lawyer tactics to spin the narrative, but I cut him off instantly. I told him to save his pathetic legal arguments for his angry creditors and the repo men. I turned my attention back to my father. He looked incredibly small, deflated, and broken. The arrogant, demanding patriarch who measured everyone's human worth by their bank account was now entirely, helplessly at the mercy of the daughter he had literally thrown away like garbage. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and asked me what I was going to do next. He asked if I was going to trigger the guarantee and ruin him. I sat back in my chair, smoothing the lapels of my suit. I told him the fundamental, irreconcilable difference between us. I told him that I did not have to lie, steal, or manipulate vulnerable people to build my massive wealth. I told him I had simply played the long, strategic game. I explained that the development project was going to be completely funded and finished under my company's strict management. It was going to turn a massive, multi-million-dollar profit within the next 2 years. But, I stated with absolute, chilling finality, not a single, solitary cent of that profit would ever have their names attached to it. I told them, looking each of them in the eye, that they were entirely, permanently cut off. There would be no angel investments in Julian's failing, pathetic law career. There would be no luxury Thanksgiving family trips to Aspen. There would be no corporate bailouts for their mortgages or their car payments. I told my father I was not going to trigger the personal guarantee to bankrupt him, simply because I did not need his money. I had simply taken his greatest asset. He was legally free from the crushing bank debt, but he had lost his entire initial investment, his massive pride, his reputation in the community, and his golden goose. The private dining room was dead silent. The heavy, suffocating illusion of our happy family was completely, permanently eradicated. They did not argue. They did not scream anymore. They did not even attempt to offer a fake apology, because they realized that an apology would be utterly useless against the mountain of hard evidence and legally binding documents sitting on the table. They just sat there, frozen in time, the crushing, inescapable weight of their new reality settling over them like a thick concrete vault. I stood up slowly from the table. I smoothed my jacket and picked up my briefcase. I looked at the three of them one last time, feeling the final, lingering remnants of my childhood attachment evaporate into the air. I told them to enjoy the rest of their evening. I casually mentioned that I had already paid the exorbitant bill in cash with the maitre d' before I walked in, so they did not have to worry about Julian's maxed-out credit cards declining at the table. I turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room without looking back. I walked through the crowded restaurant, stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air, and handed my ticket to the valet. When I slid into the driver's seat of my Ferrari and the engine roared to life, I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost brought tears to my eyes. The fallout from that dinner was incredibly swift, devastatingly brutal, and entirely of their own making. I did not have to lift a single finger, make a single phone call, or spread a single rumor to ruin their reputations. Their own staggering financial incompetence and massive egos did the job for me. Exactly 3 days after I walked out of that restaurant, I received a frantic phone call from my cousin Chloe. Her voice was a chaotic mixture of sheer awe, shock, and nervous energy. She told me that the entire extended family and the highly judgmental local suburban community were in an absolute, uncontrollable uproar. News travels incredibly fast in wealthy suburbs, especially when it involves sudden losses of money and massive public scandal. Chloe gave me the complete, detailed breakdown. My father had not left the house in 4 days. He had closed the blinds and refused to answer the door. The explosive story of his failed, multi-million-dollar real estate investment had leaked heavily to his country club friends and the local business community. The very same people he used to aggressively boast to at neighborhood HOA meetings, the people he used to look down upon, were now openly whispering behind his back at the grocery store. He had spent his entire adult life projecting the flawless image of a titan of industry, a financial genius, and now everyone in his zip code knew he had been completely, legally outmaneuvered and stripped of his assets by his own estranged daughter. The humiliation was total and absolute. To make matters worse, Chloe revealed that he was forced to quietly contact a realtor to put their beloved lakefront vacation property on the market just to cover the massive legal fees and high-interest personal debts he had accumulated, while frantically trying to save the development project before my company bought it out from under him. Julian's situation was even more pathetic and publicly humiliating. Without my parents' ability to constantly act as his financial safety net and bail him out of his terrible decisions, his entire house of cards violently collapsed. Chloe told me that Julian had brazenly driven his precious, stolen money Porsche Cayenne to his prestigious law firm on a Tuesday morning. He parked it in his reserved spot. By Tuesday afternoon, a heavy-duty repo truck had arrived in the firm's private parking lot. Because Julian had missed 3 consecutive, massive payments and arrogantly ignored the bank's final warnings, they repossessed the luxury SUV right in front of the lobby windows. His senior partners, his colleagues, and the junior associates all watched as his status symbol was towed away. It was the ultimate, inescapable social death sentence for a man whose entire identity and career were built on projecting massive, unearned wealth. To avoid total, catastrophic bankruptcy and protect his legal license, Julian was forced to quietly list his luxury downtown condo for sale at a loss. He had to pack up his designer suits and move into a cheap, cramped, rented apartment on the far outskirts of the city, far away from the elite circles he desperately craved to be a part of. He was passed over for his highly anticipated promotion. Of course, in the midst of their world burning down, they tried to contact me. When the harsh, unforgiving reality of their financial ruin and social exile fully set in, the arrogant entitlement vanished, replaced instantly by desperate, frantic, sickening panic. My secure phone line was bombarded with calls and long text messages. My mother left multiple voicemails, crying hysterically into the receiver, begging me to remember that we were flesh and blood. She pleaded with me, her voice cracking, to release just a small percentage of the equity from the real estate project back to them so they wouldn't have to face the humiliation of downsizing their lifestyle and selling the vacation home. She tried to use heavy emotional guilt, sobbing that a good, Christian daughter would never abandon her aging parents in their time of desperate need. Julian sent long, rambling, contradictory emails. In one paragraph, he was quoting obscure legal statutes, threatening me with a massive lawsuit for hostile corporate takeover and breach of fiduciary duty. In the very next paragraph, he was desperately begging for a short-term, low-interest personal loan so he could pay his rent and avoid being completely ruined. I did not listen to the entirety of the voicemails. I did not read the emails past the first sentence. I forwarded absolutely all of it directly to my legal team. I instructed my high-powered lawyers to issue formal, legally binding cease and desist letters to my father, my mother, and Julian. The letters were drafted with zero emotion and extreme legal prejudice. They explicitly stated that any further attempts to contact me, either personally, professionally, or through third-party family members, would be considered targeted harassment and would result in an immediate, crippling lawsuit and a restraining order. I changed my personal phone number. I heavily upgraded the security protocols and access lists at both my penthouse building and my corporate headquarters. I established a total, impenetrable, permanent blackout. I did not cut them off out of spite. Spite takes a massive amount of emotional energy, and I had absolutely no energy left to give them. I cut them off because I had finally, painfully recognized the absolute truth. There was nothing left to salvage. There was no loving family hiding beneath the surface. They had made it incredibly, undeniably clear exactly who they were when they stole my hard-earned money, lied maliciously about my character to anyone who would listen, and gleefully celebrated my supposed downfall. I simply responded to their toxic actions with the cold, hard, immovable boundaries of reality. I had spent my entire childhood and my 20s trying desperately to earn a seat at their table, only to finally realize that their table was rotting from the inside out. So, I built my own table, and they were permanently, irrevocably uninvited. 6 quiet months passed. The deep silence that followed the storm was the most profoundly peaceful and productive period of my entire life. The commercial real estate development project that I had aggressively acquired from my father was finally completed ahead of schedule. The luxury townhomes were stunning, highly sought after by young executives, and they sold out completely within the very first month they were placed on the market. My corporate share of the returns was astronomical. The sheer profits from that single deal alone made the $14,000 my mother had stolen look like a few pennies found lost in a couch cushion. It was during this time of massive, uninterrupted success that I received one final piece of information regarding the toxic history of my family. I was having a quiet lunch with Chloe at a cafe when she dropped the last missing puzzle piece onto the table. She revealed the dark truth about the stolen savings account. Yes, my mother had physically gone into the bank, lied to the teller, and taken the money, but she had not actually come up with the devious idea herself. The puppet master behind the theft was none other than Aunt Susan. Chloe had overheard a bitter, screaming argument between my mother and Aunt Susan during a recent, highly stressful family gathering. It turned out that Aunt Susan, who always projected an image of wealthy superiority and constantly judged me, was deeply, pathologically jealous of my mother. Years ago, after a family funeral, there had been a bitter dispute over a small inheritance. Susan never let it go. Susan had intentionally manipulated my mother, casually suggesting over tea that taking my savings account was the only logical way to protect Julian's future and teach Elena a much-needed lesson about family loyalty. Susan had intentionally planted the malicious seed to cause chaos and financial ruin in our immediate family, perfectly satisfying her own toxic, deeply rooted competitive nature. When Chloe told me this, holding her breath and expecting me to be furious, I just laughed. It was a genuine, light-hearted, completely unburdened laugh. It proved exactly why I had walked away and never looked back. They were all trapped in a miserable, suffocating crab bucket, constantly pulling each other down, lying, scheming, and destroying relationships just to maintain a pathetic illusion of superiority. I was completely unbothered by the revelation because I was no longer in their bucket. Shortly after that lunch, I received a sudden, unprompted text message on my new, secure business line. It was from David, my ex-boyfriend. The same man who had cowardly abandoned me years ago because Julian had convinced him over drinks that I was a massive financial liability. David had recently gone through a messy divorce and a brutal custody battle that left him financially drained. He had seen my face on the cover of the business magazine. His text was pathetic. He congratulated me on my massive success, talked about how much he constantly missed our deep connection, and asked if I wanted to get dinner to catch up on old times and see where things go. I didn't even type a reply. I handed the phone to Clara, my assistant, and told her to permanently block the number. I had absolutely no space in my life for fair-weather people who only loved me when I was shining and wealthy. Instead of dwelling on the pain of the past, I focused my massive wealth and energy on the future. Using a significant portion of the profits from the townhome development, I officially established the Henderson Foundation, named in honor of the former boss who had given me my first loan and believed in me when no one else did. The foundation was specifically designed to provide massive angel investments, business mentorship, college funds, and debt-free grants to young, underprivileged female entrepreneurs who lacked a traditional family support system. I took the profound pain of my past and weaponized it for good. I became the financial and emotional safety net for other women that I never had for myself. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting brilliant, fiery streaks of orange and purple across the city sky, I took my custom Ferrari out for a drive. I did not have a specific destination in mind, but my hands naturally guided the steering wheel toward the suburbs. I drove through the massive, elegant wrought iron gates of the newly completed townhome development. The streets were freshly paved and lined with young trees. Families were moving in, carrying boxes into their new homes. Children were safely riding bicycles on the wide sidewalks. The neighborhood was alive, vibrant, and incredibly beautiful. I parked the car by the main stone fountain in the center of the development and just watched the life happening around me. This entire community, this beautiful, thriving piece of the world, was completely mine. It was built directly from the ashes of my family's arrogance and the relentless, unstoppable power of my own patience. I realized something profound sitting there in the driver's seat, listening to the hum of the engine. Blood does not make a family. Shared DNA does not entitle anyone to your peace, your money, or your sanity. Sometimes, the absolute most heroic thing you can do for yourself is to stop desperately fighting for the love of people who are firmly committed to misunderstanding and using you. My parents threw me out into the freezing street hoping to break me. They thought I would drown in the storm. They did not realize I was the storm. They told me to go live in the streets. And just once, for my own absolute, undeniable satisfaction, I looked around the beautiful neighborhood I had just built, smiled to myself, and whispered the truth into the quiet car. I didn't just live in the streets. I bought the entire block. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below, so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover the story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.